Topic of that video is how to connect to Azure SQL database using managed identities. What are the benefits of using managed identities? A common challenge for developers is the management of secrets, credentials, certificates, and keys used to securely communicate between services. Managed identities eliminate the need for the developers to manage these credentials. Applications can use managed identities to obtain Azure AD tokens without having to manage any credentials. Why use managed identities to connect to Azure SQL? As I mentioned, our application can connect to a database without having to use a password. We do not have to share the password between other members of our project. We can onboard and offboard developers who will be admins of the SQL database, and we can separately add rights to the application to have read and write permissions to our database. This example will create following resources. It will be app service, which will have system assigned, and in the next scenario it will be user assigned managed identity. We'll create SQL database, and we'll check the connection between these two services. You can check the documentation for details. We'll use system assigned identity, which lifecycle is directly connected with the app service. So when we delete the app service, the identity will be also deleted. And the second one is user assigned identity, which we can share between the services. So if we delete the app service, the identity will stay. We'll have to delete it separately. As the beginning, we will create the resources using Azure CLI. Then we will create the app service plan for our app service. As I mentioned, in this scenario, we will be using system assigned managed identity. And in that scenario, we cannot create the SQL database user for that identity. So we will add this user as an admin, which is not the good practice, since we do not want to give our application the admin rights. Sufficient rights are read and write. We will do it in the next scenario when we will be using user assigned managed identity. Let's define parameters. We have to do it since the app service name and SQL server name need to be unique. So we will have no errors while we will provision that services. Right now, let's create the web application. Okay, app service is created. Right now we will assign the identity to our app service. Next step, we'll create the group where we will add admins for our SQL database. Okay, we can add users, and we can add also identities there. In this example, we will add the system assigned identity to that group. Now we can create the SQL server. As you can see, as the admin, we provided this group which we just created. The SQL server is created. Right now, let's create the database. Let's create the firewall rule. And as the last step, we need to add the configuration to our app service. so our application can create the connection string. So we have to provide database name, server name, what's the identity, and the port for our application. And finally, we can test our connection. It may take a while since our application to start up and process that request. And we have the response. So our connection is working. Right now, let's go to the next scenario where we will use user assigned identity. So for that scenario, let's delete the application on our app service first. And then we will recreate it using manage identity, user assigned manage identity. And in that scenario, we will create the user in the database, which will be this user assigned manage identity with the read and write permissions. And as an administrator of that database, I will add myself. So let's create a service plan, our service plan. Right now we can create our web application, and let's add our application settings that we need. As you can see, this time we added identity equals to user, so that's why we can build another connection string for our application, which I'll show you shortly. Right now we can create user assigned manage identity, and we can assign that user to our app service. Also, to connect, we need to add to our application one more setting, UID, which will be required for our connection string. But first, let's get the client ID of our managed identity and add that client ID as an app setting to our application. And here we can see it, that was added. Right now we can add the user to our MySQL admins group. As I mentioned, this time we can add the real user, which will be the admin of the database, the SQL server, and not the identity. So let's add it. And our user is added to the group. We can confirm it, but going to the AD, groups, MySQL, members. As you can see, the user is added to our group. Right now, we can add the manage identity, which we created, as a database user. To do that, we will use Azure. shell is ready. Right now, let's get the token. And right now we can connect to our instance and create the user, which in our case is MI SQL identity. To get the SQL server, we just have to check what the name is. Okay, and right now let's give read and write permissions to just created user. And finally, we can test the connection as before. We have the response. So the connection is also working. And here you can see the example of the connection string. As you see, when we use manage identity, user assigned manage identity, we need to provide UID, which is a client ID of our identity. Great. Right now we can delete our resources. Right now, after we delete the resources, we can recreate them using Azure Bicep. First, we will create the resource group in the subscription scope. So we have to remember to have proper permissions to do that. Let's create it. As the next step, we'll create a service. Here also we'll use a unique string, so we can have the unique names for our app service and SQL server. Then we will create the manage identity, app service plan. We will create an app service with user assigned manage identity. Here we will create the create app service with user assigned managed identity. In the properties, we need to provide that app service plan, and also we need to provide the Docker image. And here we will set the app settings parameters for our app service. Bicep do not support CRUD operation on the MS Graph resources. We can create them using the deployment script, but I will show it in other video. For this, we can recreate the group as before using Azure CLI and the Cloud Show. As the last step, we'll create the SQL database. With that, administrator type will be Active Directory. We'll provide ID of the group. And also the SQL admin. For that, let's run. Azure CLI command to get the ID of our group. And let's get the server name. Okay. And right now we can deploy the last file as a server name. We can give the name, and as a group ID we need to provide the already existing group. After our deployment is finished, we can check the resources in the Azure portal. Let's refresh. We can see our group. We can see our resources. Let's check the deployment. Deployment finished. Well, the success. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Bye.